Hello and welcome once again to CanonBlogger.com, home of the Learning Digital Photography podcast. My name is Jason Anderson. I am your author and host. Yesterday I shared with you a video tutorial on how to handle sharpening and noise reduction inside of Lightroom 4. It received a pretty positive response, so I figured I'd go ahead and share another video with you here today. So here I'm going to be sharing with you a little insider workflow or work tip on how I use this little guy right here, the graduated filter inside of Lightroom 4. So before I proceed, one thing that's worth pointing out, I've collapsed my menu bar over on the left hand side. That gives me my preview of the image with all this kind of stuff over here, the presets, collections, history, snapshots, all that sort of stuff. And I've also hidden this toolbar down here that shows me all the images in my selected folder or selected catalog. And the reason why I've done that is because that gives me a little more workspace where I can actually look at my photo, and I can also look at the details inside the develop module, so I can make sure that I'm getting the kind of image that I want to get. So I'm going to go ahead and activate the graduated filter tool inside of here, and notice when I do that, this whole detail set here changes. So by default, this is going to all look like this, and what you want to do is you want to figure out what it is you want to change. So before you do that, it helps to take a look at what this actual filter does inside of Lightroom. So if I start clicking and dragging inside the image here, you'll notice that as I drag from left to right, I get 3 vertical lines. So these vertical lines, let's talk about these just a little bit. This vertical line on the left hand side is where you're going to have more of a brightening effect if you use contrast, if you use exposure. So if I start changing the exposure values, see how that left hand side is getting brighter? Whereas if I make it darker, that will move over to the right hand side. So depending on which way you're editing inside of this adjustment brush, the exposure values can change depending on which side you want the edits to go on. It's kind of an interesting little tip to have. Same kind of effect will happen with contrast. You'll get more contrast on the left hand side, more contrast on the right hand side as you slide that back and forth. And we can go down to this whole thing, but I think you pretty much get the idea of exactly what the graduated filter brush does inside of here. So as you can see, this is probably going to be most common for those of you that like doing landscape types of photography, architectural types of photography, that sort of stuff, where you might have a darker sky and a brighter foreground, or vice versa, where you want to make a sunset pop but still get details in the foreground, or whichever effect you're going for. In this particular shot, what I like in the original shot, let me go ahead and cancel out of the adjustment filter here. I really like how I'm getting some color in here, but I don't like how dark things have looked up top. So what I want to do is lighten that up a little bit, and to do that we can use this graduated filter tool inside of Lightroom 4. So let me go ahead and turn that back on again. We already have a brush here, so if I go ahead and activate it, I can go ahead and start cranking the exposure to either direction. And notice how I said to either direction, because again, if we move it to the right, everything on the left will get brighter. If we move the slider to the left, everything on the right will get brighter. So I typically will try and increase my exposure a little bit, and I've found that the value here that works best is 1.5 stops of light. So that means I'm going to be making a 1.5 stop of light change from the low end, where it's darkest, to the high end, but I'm going to graduate that over the entire image. So having said that, we've now defined what our left side is, and we've now defined what our right side is, and the center, of course, is the neutral point. So you'll notice that the cursor or the mouse is doing different things at different places. If I get this handle, that means I can move it, and that's exactly what I'm going to be doing. I'll be moving just this right hand side. So if I click and drag that and really scrunch it down, you'll see kind of a marked change there. And this is most often what people will be using when they want to use the graduated filter for something like a sunset or a sunrise. You can kind of see the effect that this is having on the water and the effect it's having over on the left hand side of the image. So then we can talk about doing the same thing on the right. We can expand that out to make it more gradual, or we can collapse it down to make it more of a stark contrast. So when you're doing sunset shots or sunrise shots, you'll usually put this really tight and then put this on the horizon. And I probably moused over and you've seen it already, because you would rotate this simply by moving your mouse over the center bar there, over the center vertical bar, and then you can just rotate that from top to bottom by dragging it to the left and right. This is kind of a finicky little tool, so it does take some practice to get a really good handle on this and make sure it stays perfectly straight. If you move your mouse over the direct center over this dot right here, that will allow you to move the entire thing and keep the current settings intact. So now that I have the settings where I want them, I'm going to do just that. Only I'm going to move this center dot to the center just because I'm a little OCD that way. Then the other thing that I'll do is I'll get this center selected here, and I'll rotate it just a little bit more down just because I want to make it as straight as I possibly can manually. And as you can see, even with some practice, it still isn't going to be 100% exactly how I want. There, I think that's about how I want it. So once I'm finished, I'm going to go ahead and deselect the graduated filter, and that's going to hide everything. So note that this is a little different from other filters in that if I use the H key to show and hide different things, you're not going to see that appear or disappear. You would simply have to activate it, and it'll show you where the current button is. So that's kind of a helpful little insider tip. But now that I'm done, I can go ahead and export this, save it out to the web, or print it for delivery to a client. So that's my little tip on how to use the graduated filter inside of Lightroom 4. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time here at CanonBlogger.com.